Sí, hola. Hello. I'm just going to talk in English. I hope that's fine for all of you, and you have your automatic translation. So welcome to this very eclectic table, we could call it, that we call the fantasy that's coming. Let's just say fantasy as a very, very, very broad sense. So you can see we have a lot of people here, a lot of great, great authors that we've seen through the festival. We have over there Nicholas.
Hello.
And Nick. We have Jennifer. We have Francesco. We have Lucy, Anna, Giovanna, and Alexandra.
Thank you.
Good. I really, really hope you've been to their respective tables and speeches and so on, because we're not going to talk specifically about their recent books, but more about what it's connecting all of them. So let's just do a mind game. Let's all of us picture a really big tree, and we are in the trunk of the tree. So we are in the very big trunk of the tree. That's called fantasy. And then the roots of the tree, it's folklore, cultural roots, where we come from, the country we are from, what we learn, oral tradition and just tradition. That's the roots of the tree. Then we have the land, that's just what we call literature, right, where we thrive from. And then we have the branches, and you guys are the branches. So we have branches that are very far away, branches are in the middle, branches are pretty dark. All kinds of branches in that tree. But we come from the same trunk. We kind of grow from that same trunk. And that's actually one of my first questions. If we are trying to picture that tree, all of us are picturing that tree, what personal conditions made you grow in that particular branch? So if you want to start, Alexandra, so just go over there.
The pressure is on.
Yes, I know.
Oh, that's such an interesting question, because I grew up, my dad was a Star Wars collector from the time I was in maybe first or second grade until he passed away in 2012. And he himself was a very avid reader of fantasy, so I would see him constantly reading fantasy books, and he loved the genre. And so I had a very early exposure to it, and it was very normalized for me from the beginning, but Star Wars and sort of the epic storytelling within Star Wars was really my first introduction to the world of fantasy. I consider Star Wars more fantasy than science fiction. Do you agree or disagree?
I completely agree. I love
agree or disagree? No, I agree.
That's a nice tree.
So, yeah, that is a big, vast tree.
Yeah, it is.
What about you?
Oh.
Well, in my case, first, pardon my English, it will be the entertainment tonight.
No.
No, it's okay.
In my case, when I was very child, I used to read comics from Argentina, from the publisher Columbia, I think. And this considered like a minor literature, literatura menor, was the very nutrient for me. I used to read these comics and really loved the characters, like, for example, Gilgamesh, El Inmortal.
Oh.
So I considered that science fiction at the beginning was my first food for the imagination. I consider that the seed for all of us, the common seed, is imagination, in fact. What I have been realizing lately is that science fiction and fantasy have narrowed the subtle shifting territory that used to divide them. From the beginning, both genres aimed to challenge the reason as the privileged instrumental tool to understand the world. But now I think they are sharing same zone. Both genres are now challenging, are responding to a demand to narrate a world that is turned upside down completely, a world ruled by algorithm. And so the question now is what to narrate now. And I want to just leave this question here in the round table.
But let's talk about that later, because I have some questions related to that, and it's a great topic. We'll see. So Anna said dark branches. You probably was like, hey, that's me.
Okay, hello, my name is Anna Starobinets.
I'm from Moscow, and I do write dark sci-fi and horror stories.
Oh, wow.
And okay, that happened to me first time 17 years ago. When I gave birth to my older child, I was so scared about that I immediately started writing a collection of horror stories. That was my first book. And I was thinking, like, this very nice baby is going to be a teenager one day. She is actually 17 right now. She's going to be a teenager, and she'll change entirely. And I'll lose connection to her. She'll turn into someone else. And so I wrote a short story, which is still called sorry, An Awkward Age. And it was a story about a boy in his who was about 13 years old, and everyone around him were thinking that he was just a teenager. That's why he looked so ugly and behaved so ugly. But actually, he was turning into a monster. The baby scared me, okay?
They're very scary.
I understand you.
That's it.
So, Lucy, what do you think?
My story is quite similar to Alex's. My father read a lot of fantasy to us as children. My sister is a writer as well, to nobody's surprise. But when we were maybe 5 or 6, he started us on The Hobbit, and then very soon after, The Lord of the Rings, Brian Aldiss, these pretty chunky adult texts for very small children. And so I think I imbibed a lot of the archetypes of fantasy, because fantasy is a massively archetypal genre. And I think it was one of the reasons I got sucked into writing epic fantasy, which is what I started out doing. As a teenager, I was pretty much a loner, a bit of a misfit. I spent a lot of time in my bedroom reading about much larger stories than I thought my own was. And I think maybe that's what we're drawn to in fantasy, because these stories are really stories about finding your identity. They're often journeys of the self. And when you're a teenager, you're very much grasping after who you want to be, who you are. So I ended up reading a lot of big, chunky, epic fantasy farm boy becomes hero narratives. And that's the path I went down when I became a professional writer. And it's taken me, probably a good decade to begin to find my own voice. Because this is the problem with fantasy, and particularly fantasy that was written in the 70s, 80s, when it was a very Tolkien-inspired genre. We had a lot of male stories. We had a lot of male heroes, and I was very much kind of aping that, and I was copying that style. And it has taken me a while to kind of separate myself out from what we would now consider very classic, very traditional fantasy. And the wonderful thing is the field is growing and changing all the time. So I'm really excited to be a part of fantasy today.
Yeah. So actually, a little parenthesis. You just told me, Francesco, that I'm not a writer, but you are a game designer, and that has a lot to do with writing, actually, in a way. So, what do your roots come from? Like, what do you choose that branch in particular to express your stories?
Well, being a game designer, I worked a lot on other people's fantasies. I mean, different themes, different books, The Lord of the Rings and Conan, and even Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. And so it's more about exploring even the hidden themes behind what makes some world tick, and what makes how it is possible to disassemble them and make people, players, able to use them in their own way. But as far as my inspiration comes from, I mean, my sources in the beginning, I think that most of the fantasy I was exposed to is what Alexandra and Lucy described as their parents' fantasy, then that tells me a bit about my age. But Joanna also mentioned the comics from Latin America, and I realized that was a lot of my background in fantasy, with like the Eternauta by Osterheld or Juan Jimenez, and a lot of those Robin Wood, or those storytellers made a lot of my fantasy background, in addition to Fritz Leiber and Robert Howard, Tolkien, and so on.
Yeah, so Alexandra, you just rewrote a very famous myth, like a Greek myth, in a very modern way. So I would like to know, why did you end up there? That's so interesting.
So, sorry, would you mind repeating the question? I didn't catch everything you said.
Yes.
I'm so sorry.
No, that why did you end up rewriting that particular Greek myth? Like whether your personal conditions brought you up there.
So I came to fantasy through Greek mythology, and I didn't have another route into it. My parents used to take us on holiday to Greek islands. One of my earliest memories is being in this huge ruined amphitheatre in Cyprus. And so I grew up reading the myths and hearing the myths. And then when I had my own children, I found that I was telling them those same stories. So what you said about oral tradition really strikes a chord with me, that these stories get passed down through the generations. And I loved being a part of that. But like you said, that really resonated with me, that becoming a mother opens you up not just to so much light and joy, but the flip side is those incredibly dark fears and anxieties. And although it's the story of Ariadne that I've written, I did start it with Ariadne's mother, who gives birth to the Minotaur. And I just think that idea that you give birth to something monstrous,
No, she was nice. There is so much in it, and I think it so speaks to your deepest fears and kind of the whole human condition made into this kind of magical, fantastical thing, where it's a safe way to explore it, a safe way to explore, what if I do give birth to a monster? What if I do not recognize my own child? I think that was such a great thing that you said, and I completely relate to that.
So Nicholas?
Well, they took all the good answers. Babies scare me too. My parents are responsible for me being a fantasy author, but not because they read, because they don't. And mostly because they never encouraged me to get a real job. They were very, very, very supportive. And when I was a kid, I read, I think Tolkien was probably the first fantasy book that I read that got me really interested. And fantasy stories are kind of one of the only kinds of stories that come in trilogies. And so the idea of getting to the end of a book and finding out there's more and having to wait for more was something that really appealed to me. And then I got a Nintendo and played Final Fantasy, and that was pretty inspiring. And then I was very late on a school project once, and I had 2 days to turn in a book report. And I had to pick something Canadian, so I picked something Canadian. It was book 3 in a trilogy, which obviously you should never start with. I was hopelessly confused. I started reading this book. I hated everything about it. It was about people from Toronto taken to a fantasy world. It had King Arthur. It felt pretty typical to me. And then cut to a day later, and I was bawling my eyes out. Crying and crying and crying, and I'd never cried at a book in my life. And that author, his name is Guy Gavriel Kay, who's a huge hero of mine now. And the more of his books I read, the more I cried, and the more I wanted to kind of write something that affected people the way that affected me. So it was during one of his very particular books called Lord of Emperors, which is about art and legacy and kind of what you leave behind. And it was on a very specific page of that book that I thought I would really, really love to leave something behind that's even remotely as beautiful as this. So I tried for the next 10 years to write something just like that, and failed and failed and failed. And then finally wrote something that was more particular to myself, which is, tries to be funny, succeeds sometimes, and is inspired by all the things that I loved. So Tolkien, classic fantasy, Dungeons and Dragons, Final Fantasy, everything but the kitchen sink. And that worked.
Yeah. So I have the impression, listening to all of you, that instead of the big trunk, you're talking about bigger branches that you spread from. talking like Anglo-Saxon tradition, but there's some differences here. I think, and you could disagree with me, of course, that you kind of unconsciously, because of your traditions, pick up those branches, right? And you jumped on those branches because that's what's like in the back of your brain, that's what itches, right? And do you think that the next book you may write will be like in a totally different tree, totally different branch? Let's say, instead of writing about Medusa, Ariadne, the sisters, the three sisters and the missing sister, you want to write it in another code, thriller code, horror code, whatever other code that's not fantasy tree. Why would it, like, if you try to make that mental game, why and what fantasy give your stories? That's like, this is the key. Like, it needs to be fantasy. That's why I wrote in fantasy. That's why I jumped in the fantasy tree. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think I've got the gist of what you were asking. Do you want me to start again?
You want me to start?
Again?
Oh yeah. Let's
Okay.
go like that. I
Okay.
think that worked pretty great.
So I've actually written across a couple different subgenres of fantasy, I guess you could say. The Darkest Mind series is more of like a dystopian fantasy, although dystopia sometimes falls under science fiction. I've written time travel fantasy, and now with Lore, it's more of a contemporary fantasy that utilizes it utilizes Greek mythology, but it's set in the modern world. So I really have enjoyed the challenges of playing with each little subgenre, but across the board, I think even exploring a new subgenre of fantasy, I always center my stories very heavily on my characters and their relationships with the other characters around them. It's always, because I write YA, a coming-of-age story in some way, and it's usually a young woman who's discovering that innate power that they have in themselves. So I would say I love exploring other subgenres, but I know my next story, for example, stays kind of within the realm of lore in that it is another contemporary fantasy that uses more Celtic folklore this time and Arthurian lore. So it's different but similar because I'm just enjoying it so much. And I think with fantasy, there's just, it's so joyful, even when you're writing dark fantasy. I guess that sounds terrible, but it's so joyful to get to live in your imagination so fully and to go on these adventures with characters.
Yeah. So I'm going to jump over there because, for example, I'm very curious. You have a retired rock band that go back into the stage, and you chose epic fantasy for them. That's,
Don't ask me. No. Yeah, for me, that was the kind of thing you'd think I'd be stoned when I thought of it, but I wasn't. It was just kind of listening to it, and I thought, what if, mercenary bands were the equivalent of rock bands, were treated like rock stars, and thought someone must have done this already, and I looked it up, and no one had, so I was like, I better do it quick. Yeah, that I think, and ultimately that idea, the idea itself of a retired mercenary band, the guys who have aches and pains and have to pee 5 times a night going back on the road into a world that they're not prepared for, that has moved on without them, is kind of inherently funny. So I think that helped me write a story that was more honest, at least to myself. And I think if I had to pick one, through line that's always going to be in my work from now on, it is humor, just because. And I think a lot of fantasy doesn't really touch on it that much. It's been very stoic, and it has, characters laugh at things, and I'm like, okay, that was a joke, I guess. But I think, and humor is obviously not going to land with everyone, but to me, I think whatever kind of fantasy or sci-fi or anything I write, I will always try to infuse it with humor.
Yeah. So, Giovanna, for example, you mentioned a lot also science fiction. Why do you choose like these particular tools for your books?
Well, first of all, I have to clarify that I really don't like my work to be organized, put, marked by a category, a genre. I do not write thinking previously, now I'm going to write in science fiction mood or in fantasy mood. However, sometimes it's impossible when you are writing in that zone that readers don't really identify your work with a genre. But I must say that, for example, in my book, Tierra Fresca de su tumba, I think the translation will be like fresh dirt from the grave. I have characters that we cannot say they are like fantastic. However, it could be said that they are kind of a revenant because most of them have returned from symbolic death. And they carry a painful information that is impossible for them to transmit, as if they possessed a very deep information that they cannot transmit to anybody. And for instance, I have a short story in this book, Pez Tortuga Buitre, Fish Turtle Vulture. And in this short story, there is a fisherman that has lived with his dead admiral, has conversed with him, embodying a transfer of data about the experience of death itself. And in another short story, in my book, Para Comerte Mejor, I think the translation can be the better to eat you with. I have a...
You like it?
You like it?
Mm-hmm. That was a great title.
Yeah, I know. In that short story, I have a vampire. This vampire is living in a region in Bolivia that is very tropical. So this is like an Amazonian vampire. And he is exhausted from living. And eventually he's moved, I don't know how really pronounce this, moved by townspeople in a kind of lynching reminiscent of Fuente Ovejuna. I wanted my vampire to regain the condition, the personality of the original vampire, a loner, unlikely or different from the other contemporary vampires who live in community. I like my vampire to really be like a thoughtful vampire. He prefers to think and to cultivate his intimate darkness. That is the kind of characters that I prefer to work with. Thank you.
So, Jennifer? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm also interested in, why did you choose this Greek mythology myth in particular to talk about? You were saying like to give birth to a monster, right? And not other, and not maybe just not a myth, maybe just like a very day-to-day story with a normal mother living, I don't know, in New York, for example.
I mean, I just can't imagine writing something that didn't include magic. I think it's so... There is, I think, like Alexandra said, there is so much joy in it, even in the darkest places that it takes you to. And my second novel that I wrote during the pandemic is Electra. It's very claustrophobic, it's very twisted, it's very dark. But even going to that place, it was an escape. And I think that's something we've all craved so much in the last 18 months, that I just think if you can go to another world that is governed by these strange and unpredictable forces, there is so much to play with, there is so much that your imagination can do with it. And I think it's so freeing as a writer to do that. And I think that I just can't imagine writing. I always sort of played around with other ideas before I came to Greek mythology, and I could never really find my voice in writing anything else. And this is where I just feel there are so many stories still to tell, and I don't think we'll ever exhaust them. So I want to keep developing them. I think it's such a rich and rewarding world to escape into.
Yes. So Anna, your stories, we could say mostly horror, and then you use some other tools, right? Like science fiction, you said. You also use some kind of dark fantasy tools. Why did you choose those in particular? Like, do you believe in fear through the word? Do you believe in just expressing what's in you and it comes out that way?
as I mentioned, I'm from Russia, so in a way, I stick to some Russian traditions. Like maybe you heard about Mikhail Bulgakov. He wrote a story about a doctor. Who, actually, he's a great writer. He's a classical writer, but this is a sci-fi story about a doctor who took a little piece of brain from a marginal proletarian, from a human alcoholic, and put that small piece of brain into a dog, and then the dog turned into Mr. Sharikov. And actually, for Bulgakov, that was a fantastic assumption, like that this operation is possible. But actually, for him, it was the way, the easiest way to talk about the revolution and about the new era in Russia, new people who came and who replaced the people who lived before them. And to me, sci-fi is approximately the same. Like, I'm not really interested in stories which have no connection to the reality. I talk about the reality, but I like to use normally only one, like fantastic or sci-fi assumption. Mm-hmm. For instance, I have a collection of short stories which is called the Icarus gland, La Glandula de Icarus. Yeah. And for instance, I thought, like, let's assume that men have an organ which is called this glandula somewhere here, which make them, maybe it is a soul, maybe it is something that make them aggressive, but in that world I describe, everything is the same, but for the necessity to get rid of that gland in order to be a pleasant and not aggressive person. And those men who keep that gland, they cheat on their wives, for instance, or they really can fight someone. So, but I actually talk about other things, like social things, but I use that fantastic assumption, or in that story about the boy who turned into a monster, I assumed that maybe it is possible that an ant gets into the head of a boy and then he turns into a kind of ant kingdom, multiplicity, like he's not alone anymore. There are lots of voices in his head, and those are the voices of insects. So what I was actually I was talking about, well, it is just a means of delivering various stories about reality, but I pack it into a fantastic package.
So, Francesco, I think you just mentioned a lot of very famous franchises you've been working with, Conan, Lord of the Rings. Why did you choose those? Is it because of creativity, like free creativity? Is it because of what you like?
Well, I started designing games because I wanted to work in a creative field. And especially I started working with thematic games and role-playing games because of that, because they go beyond just designing a mechanic that works, but they're usually tied to world building and stuff like that. So yeah, I worked on original games, but then something happened. I mean, our game on the Lord of the Rings called War of the Ring was a very good seller, went well, still selling after 17 years. And so me and my co-designer Marco Maggi eventually became known for being able to translate well a literary world into a game. And so that's why we were asked to work also on Conan and Lovecraft and so on. But now it's evolving a bit, because this ability, we're trying to use it in a way that is trying to bring alive a theme that can be anything, can be from a movie, can be literary, can be invented and translated into a game. So now we're working for a bigger company that has many intellectual properties. Most of them are original. And so we're right now a bit schizophrenic because we're working on zombie apocalypse games, and then a Cthulhu-inspired game, and then a science fiction one, and then a fantasy Roman alternate history game. So we're wearing many hats. But the fil rouge, the leitmotif is still creating games that make you feel the theme in a very effective way, not simply because it's a nice cover or it's a nice name, but it's something that when you play it, it is a Roman fantasy. It's not something else. Okay.
And Lucy, for example, when I was reading your book, I thought like this could be perfectly without any magic and any fantasy, but you include it, and then I think it's pretty obvious. And there's some mentions to witches, and in the very first page, right? Yeah, why did you choose to, maybe not intentionally, but to include all those? Like this has to be in this myth for sure.
Anyone who came to my previous event with Jennifer, we talked about this a bit actually, about the inclusion of magic. I said that the first draft of Sister Song had no magic in it at all. It was pretty straight, apart from the transformation of the harp sequence, which stood out like a sore thumb, that did need a bit of work. But I talked about it in relation to, because one of the elements I really wanted to explore in the period was this intersection, this clash between Christianity, this new monotheistic religion, meeting established pagan tradition. And I already had the two avatars on the stage here. I had Gildas, who is a real monk. He's our main primary source for 6th century Britain, a great advocate of Christianity who believed that he was doing God's work, saving people, basically. And we had Merlin, who is my kind of Merlin avatar, who seemed to be in a perfect position to articulate the old ways, the human's connection with the landscape. There's a lot of talk about humanity turning its eyes up instead of down, and I feel like in a way that is still a relevant discussion today. We're talking about using fantasy as a lens to talk about real issues, and I feel like there's a lot of people who talk to me and say, well, Sister Song is a book about the environment. It's also a book about climate change. It's saying that we have lost our connection with the natural world and the dangers that result from losing that connection. So having the magic there, setting off against religion, actually provided the main tension of the novel, as well as, giving me an opportunity to explore a really interesting period in history where, these two religions were fighting for the soul of the nation.
Yeah, I have the impression that all of you, like we live in 2021, although you're writing about a very old, also you and you're writing about some very old things that happened very long time ago. You're writing from now, so you're writing about the issues that are happening now. So let's go back to the tree and let's go a little bit down and let's go to, you mentioned tradition, but let's call it myth. Let's just call it myth. Let's not get academic, but let's just say myth and include everything there. Okay, let's just do this for the sake of the conversation. Because, for example, we have rock myths, we have Greek myths, we have mythical creatures, we have also mythical weird glands. But why do you think mythology, in a very, very broad sense, is a gateway to introduce new readers to fantasy, to reading more, let's say, because all of us like fantasy, and all of us have read the classics, most of us, and more hardcore, we could say, fantasy books, like you said, you were mentioning chunky books. So you think mythology as a tool, again, always more than a genre, as a tool for writing, can introduce new readers into more other kind of fantasy books, like talking about a vampire in the forest, in the selva, right? Why a vampire, for example? Do you think that could be more attractive to, let's say, younger readers that are starting to to read?
Well, first, I think I can't think of writing work without myth. We are always connected with mythology. We can write out of it. That is first thing that I want to underline. In my case, why a vampire? Well, because first, as I was telling you, since my very early childhood, I read a lot of stories about vampires, eternal creatures, and that kind of supernatural characters. So it was natural for me as well to rewrite my own vampire. You were talking about motherhood and how motherhood is like a factor to rewrite things. And I like to think, for example, if in motherhood as an opportunity to rewrite, because it shifts your imagination into a different sensibility. Well, in my case as well, when I had my children, I didn't want them just to enjoy a short story before going to bed. That was nice, colorful, I don't know, very innocent. I wanted them to enjoy the same kind of beautiful fear that I felt when I was a child. So vampire was one of my sources to do that. But what I also think is that what is happening now, what is really happening, is a series of exploration about the return of our human species to its primordial, or I don't know in English, to its original condition. Mm-hmm. And it means that we are archetypally connected to mythology. We cannot think our life without it. So it's not just a decision to seduce readers. Oh, come reader to my short story and enjoy it. It's because that is our true nature. Our nature is to think about life from this perspective. So it's not just rewriting and updating the old characters. It's more than that. Thinking and writing from mythology is thinking about the future of our human species at this moment, at this very critical moment. We are in a global crisis. You were mentioning climate change, and we are really in a moment that we need to go back to see ourselves in a mirror and to think what we have done with our species, and not only with our own species, but with a more intelligent species like animals. I think they are more intelligent because they really know how to adapt to the changes we have provoked. So mythology is a part of our responsibility, of our philosophical responsibility.
And Alexandra,
I agree. A lot of what you were saying was resonating with me, which is why I was nodding like, yes, yes, yes. I think for me, I was introduced to a lot of these stories at a very young age. My mom's side of the family is Greek, and even though there's obviously a huge difference between ancient Greek culture and modern Greek culture, it was kind of her way of starting to introduce us, my siblings and I, to that side of our heritage. And I loved Greek myths from such a young age, but even then, even as a child, even children can pick up on the problematic aspects of it because we're viewing, these ancient stories through a modern lens, however unfair that may be to the original tellers of the tale. And so in writing lore, I just really wanted to see how those ancient ideas and beliefs clashed with our modern world to show both how far we've come and how far we haven't come. So it's really using these stories that we've grown up with and that are so deeply ingrained with us in our storytelling as humans to reflect on how things have changed, how things could be better. But also with lore, I was really brainstorming the story during the Me Too movement, during all of the conversations that rose about it. And that's one of the reasons why I started thinking about Greek mythology again, because that resonated so strongly with many of the stories. And so I think it's inevitable that we reflect back on these very familiar stories, a lot of, that we cherish essentially, and we, I guess, want to put our own spin on it, or just want to use it to, reflect and kind of ruminate on our present day. I'm curious to hear Jennifer's answer to this too.
Well, I'm so interested that you were writing against the backdrop of the Me Too movement, because exactly the same.
Yeah.
And I just think that's so, I'm not surprised that we went to Greek mythology
Yes.
when all of this was happening, because it's not just Me Too now. I just felt like I could hear the voices from 3,000 years ago saying, yeah, Me Too as well.
Yes.
That kind of misogyny has stayed alive, and you feel it and you recognise it. And we've both used Medusa in our novels, and I think she is getting so much attention at the moment because she speaks to our standards of female beauty, of victimhood, of making a monster out of a woman in punishment for what a man has done to her. And I think that you come to Greek mythology with so much recognition of actually, not only are these stories that, yes, I heard as a child, so I'm familiar with them, so it's kind of a safe way into fantasy as well, because it's something that we really feel ingrained in our own culture, but also because you see there are so many parallels and there is so much still to explore. And I think that as women taking on these narratives, I feel like it's a really powerful thing to take those women from those myths and give them that voice and that agency and that reimagining, and to say, actually, we're going to tell it our way now. And I'm really glad that we're doing it.
Yeah, me too. It's nice to celebrate them rather than have them punished over and over again in these stories, abandoned, punished, scorned. It's so refreshing to have the focus on the women of these stories. Finally.
At last.
Yeah, Lucy, you actually also fit in this description. You give voice to some characters that were unvoiced for so long, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the reasons I wrote Sister Song the way I did, with 3 point of view characters, was to give voice to the third sibling, who is mentioned ever so briefly in the first verse of the ballad and then who disappears. And it just made me think, why is this person's story gone? Why is it not remembered? And then I realized that it's not remembered because The Two Sisters is a patriarchal narrative. It is about 2 women fighting over a man, and the one who walks away from the story unscathed is the man. Both women suffer. And so for Keen, who is transgender, there is no space in that very binary narrative for him to be who he is. But that isn't absolutely not the case historically. There were many, and I have a wonderful sensitivity reader who taught me a lot about transgender history. And there were many societies in which these people were celebrated and honored and made. It was inclusive. So a lot of this discourse I hear today, this backlash about, transgender is a new fad or it's a passing craze. I'm like, it's not, it's ancient. It's as ancient as humanity is ancient. And it's part of what Alex and Jennifer were saying about women's stories. It also extends into marginalized groups who just have not had a chance to be heard and say, look, we've always existed, and the stories always have been ours too, but the dominant narrative, which is often the patriarchal narrative, has not left us room to tell them. And I think we're finally moving into an age where people feel that they can speak up and say, I'm going to use this ancient framework to bring to life, to give voice to the people who've always been here in the shadows. And these are shadows cast by the dominant group. but that doesn't mean their stories didn't happen and they're no less important. And I just love the fact that this whole kind of the zeitgeist of mythological retellings and reimaginings is providing a wonderful outlet to hear these alternative stories, to hear points of view that have been suppressed for far too long.
So I'm actually, thank you. I'm actually very interested in Francesco about, because before you mentioned about translating or rewriting in another code, right? A novel, let's say, or a group of novels into a game. When you do that, do you, let's say, modernize it? Like, do you adapt it for the actual players, the actual public, like the actual sensitivities? Or do you just go through of the book, like for the book?
It depends on the game and on the book the game is based on. Because, for example, it would never cross my mind to touch anything from the content of The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. So in that case, the games we do based on Tolkien, for example, are directly aimed at the fans, at the readers. So they need to find in the game what they find in the books. So we cannot absolutely imagine to touch that. Of course, there's an interesting point of view when you play games and when you design games, is that you are handing over the tools to the players. So what they do with the tools is not your business. I mean, you of course give limits to them so that they don't go out of the theme of the game. You just give them the buttons they need to play in that playground. But then again, what they do with it, it's their decision, and especially with role-playing games. I must say that, listening to what you were saying, that probably the gaming business is still a bit behind, just because of the demographics, the fact that most players, the majority of players are male. And so for the moment, we are taking baby steps in the direction of changing what you will find in games. For example, standard role-playing games from especially the past decades just had character creation and a combat system plus magic. So only people that were interested in playing warriors and hacking monsters to pieces and magicians casting fireballs to fry monsters were interested in playing the games. But now, for example, I saw a nice game on Kickstarter called Flabbergasted that is a game that is totally aimed at recreating social situations in a sort of idealized 30s. So it's all about conversation and solving mysteries and going to parties and stuff like that. So it's expanding the possibilities of gaming to different options. So yeah, what is interesting is that the companies and the designers are very interested in going in that direction for many reasons, also economical ones, because of course, but also because, yes, we're fed up with just staying in the same things, having the same limitations. And going to your questions to close it up, for example, working on, it is possible to modernize something when it is unacceptable to just translate the source material 100% faithfully. I will raise one situation that is about H.P. Lovecraft, for example, that is hugely popular in gaming, the Cthulhu mythos, let's call it like that. So in horror stories in a world where elder gods are pulling the strings behind the scenes or waiting just to devour humanity. But there's the issue of some elements of racism and misogyny that the author brought to the stories. And so it is a moment where we are actually thinking about how to deal with that. How to get rid of that. Should we get rid of it? Should we just ignore it? Should we just cherry pick what we like from the stories of Lovecraft, or should we recast them in a different way? So Luckily, it's not an IP that owned by anyone, so anyone can do anything with it. So we're seeing a lot of very different games based on HP Lovecraft.
So
This is very curious, it's very interesting what he was saying. The other day I was in Walmart looking for a gift for a kid. And Walmart was full of toys, kind of a revival of He-Man and those type of characters. And I couldn't find She-Ra.
Oh.
Yeah, and it was, what? This is incomplete.
Yeah.
So I have 3 more pages of questions, but we'll run out of time. We just have around 10 minutes. So I think it will be very interesting if anyone from over there would like to ask anything to any of you. If you do, please say to who. If it's for everyone, let's everyone. But just mention to who's the question, please.
Hi, my name is Ariane, and I have 2 questions. One is like for all of you, and the other one is for Alexandra. My first question is, what would you advise to someone who is starting right now to write something fantasy or something like that? And for Alexandra, what did you feel when suddenly a book that you wrote turned into a movie? Because that's something that's really amazing to happen to a writer, and well, I wish to know what you felt.
You want to start?
Oh yeah, I'm happy to start. The word I would use is surreal. It's very strange. It's almost like an out-of-body experience. I wasn't really super involved with the adaptation itself, which I think is why the movie ended up being a little bit different from the book. But it was wonderful and completely weird that's the only way I can describe it, to be on set, to see actors dressed as the characters, to see the van that you described in the book, to see all of these people kind of taking ownership of the story and having it become this wonderful group project. It really was just mind-blowing and surreal and just fabulous. I would love for another book to become a movie. Let's end it there.
And what about the advice?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, what do you guys think about, what's the
Anna?
advice you would give?
So Anna, for example, do you have any advice, Anna? Do you have any advice to? Yeah. You have any advice to anyone who would like to start writing?
Well, I can share the advice my colleague writer once gave me. I didn't follow it. He said, please write only if you can't help writing. Like, if you can avoid writing, don't write.
Yeah. That's a great advice.
And if you?
No,
You
yeah,
didn't follow it.
that is actually very practical advice, because there are so many highs and lows within the career, and there's so much rejection. Even as a published author, you get rejections. Negative reviews from readers are kind of a form of rejection. You submit story ideas that aren't taken, so you really do have to develop a lot of grit. And I think that idea is like, unless you are absolutely in love with what you're doing, it's such a hard career choice to try to navigate.
Especially when it comes to script writing.
Yeah.
Then, well,
Script writing.
yeah,
Next level. Frustrating.
After I've written several books, and then I started writing film scripts. Then I found out that is a real torture. Like, everything that happened to me before was just excellent.
Yeah.
Because when you write film scripts, like, there are hundreds of people on the project, and each of them has an opinion on what you are doing. And each of them has an advice how you could improve what you are doing.
This is how the Darkest Minds movie ended up so different from the book, because so many people weigh in. It's fascinating.
One thing I would say about getting into fantasy is, especially if you're thinking of writing epic fantasy or secondary world fantasy, I think a lot of people think that they have to have this world Bible, that they have to sit on their own and think about this world and think, well, am I going to put religion in it? What kind of currency are my characters going to use? What kind of social structure will there be? And I had an argument with a very preeminent American fantasy author about this.
Name him.
Can we know him?
Yeah, much more famous than me, and we said totally opposite things. He was like, world Bibles, very important. You should not start writing until, the world is in place. And I was like, just start writing. Because if you don't, you'll never get it written. You just have to go for it. And actually, the whole point about, especially with the secondary world, it always comes across, the world building itself is more organic if your characters discover the world along with you. And I just feel that, it means that it brings the reader kind of into the head of the characters more effectively. I mean, it might not work for everybody, but I feel like it's important to say that you don't have to have this entire world structured out before you even begin writing. It's fun just to go for it and see what happens.
Any other advice?
Well, I can add the perspective of a game designer, and it won't probably come as a surprise to anyone, but a lot of people think, for example, that for Tolkien, he had a world Bible before because he worked on his world for decades before he wrote the Lord of the Rings. But actually, when you actually study the process of writing the Lord of the Rings, the vast majority of what he wrote for the Lord of the Rings story was created as he was writing it. It was not something that existed already. A lot of the realms, like Rohan and Gondor, existed only in the moment where the characters arrived there. So it's exactly the same thing. Tolkien is considered the one who has created the vastest world Bible ever, but it was not like that. He never sacrificed the necessity of telling a good story or wasting pages in describing things. He probably couldn't. It was probably very hard for him. That's why he then wrote the appendixes to the Lord of the Rings, adding everything else. But he kept all that stuff separate from the story because it was not part of the perspective of the characters. And when I made the One Ring, that is the Lord of the Rings role-playing game, I had this very much in mind because you don't need to be a Tolkien scholar to play the game. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to play it because all the characters will be like aliens dropped in Middle Earth, knowing everything. Where all the characters, of course, won't know anything about it. So it's a very good advice. You need to keep your focus on the storytelling and not on the unnecessary details that will come eventually.
That is so fascinating. I tend to make a story Bible when I'm revising, but it's only because I have the memory of a goldfish and I forget what I've already written. So wow, how did he do that? My mind is blown.
How do you do that? That's difficult because on the other side you have to be a heterogeneous reader. Even though you need to focus, I think that reading everything without discrimination is another tool that is really very helpful. For example, Christianity, what you were explaining about how you are using all the information, the mythology, the history from the Christianity. I think for everybody, it doesn't matter what you are writing about. It is really a very rich source of imagination. So also that is my advice. Read everything, even the prescription of a medicine. It helps.
So I don't think we have time for any more questions. I'm sorry, we just got one, but there's a lot of great guests here. So please give them a very warm applause.
Thank you for being such a great moderator.
Thank you for coming.
Okay. Thank you, Alexander, Alexandra, Joanna, Anna, Lucy, Francesco, Jennifer, Nicholas. El 42 es vuestra casa.
Hell 42. 42 is your house. Come back whenever you want. We will invite you again. Thank you everyone for being here. They're going to be outside signing their books. Probably many people is going to be there, but it's late, so they're not going to be there for long. So of course they're going to sign outside at their slot. Giovanna and Anna will be there signing tomorrow, and they will have their slot for that. And we just wanted to tell you that the motto of the 42 make sense tonight. There's other worlds, but they are all here at the 42. We've seen all of their worlds. We've seen all of the worlds they've shared with us. It's an honor. And I would just like to ask you that even if you go to the signatures, I know you want to go to dinner as well, but there's something else we prepared with a lot of affection, which are the 42 awards, and there's going to be people honored in the next door, in the room next door. So if you feel like it, it will be a pleasure to have you there. So tomorrow we have the last day. There's many hours, I know. Thank you very much.
Sí.